In 1872, on the Manhattan side of the East River, a laborer stepped into a narrow iron chamber and waited for the door to seal behind him. Above him was New York, ferry whistles, wagon wheels, horses on wet streets, men shouting along the waterfront. The constant movement of two cities that meted each other, but were still separated by a dangerous, crowded river. Below him was something most people in New York would never see. A wooden room under the East River. It was not a tunnel. It was not a cave. It was a giant box, open at the bottom, forced down into the mud by the weight of a stone tower being built on top of it. The men called it a caisson. Inside, compressed air pushed back against the river and kept the water from rushing in. The pressure was heavy in the ears. The air was warm, damp, and foul. Gas lights threw shadows across timber walls.
The floor was mud, clay, boulders, broken riverbed, and whatever the workers could loosen with picks, shovels, bars, and charges of dynamite. A man could spend hours down there and feel, for a while, that the system was working. The water stayed out. The lights stayed lit, the tools kept moving, the tower above kept getting heavier. But the real danger often came after the shift was over, when the worker left the compressed air. When he rose back toward the surface. When ordinary atmosphere returned too quickly. That was when a man who had just been digging under the river could feel pain bloom in his joints. He could lose strength in his legs. He could become dizzy, weak, sick, confused. His speech could slur. His stomach could twist. His body could punish him for surviving the river. Today we call it decompression sickness. Divers call it the bends. In the early 1870s, the men building the Brooklyn Bridge knew it first as caisson disease.
And before doctors understood it clearly, the workers under the East River became part of the experiment. This is the story of the Brooklyn Bridge before it became a postcard, before it became a skyline, before tourists stood on its promenade with cameras, before it became one of the most famous bridges on Earth. It was two enormous wooden boxes sunk into the riverbed. It was men working in pressure and darkness. It was a bridge that had to begin under the water before it could rise into the sky. And it was built before modern machines could do that work for them. The Brooklyn Bridge looks inevitable today. It connects Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn Heights. Its main span stretches 1,595.5 feet. At the center, the roadway clears the East River by 135 feet. Including its approaches, the bridge runs more than 6,000 feet. Those numbers now feel like trivia because the bridge feels permanent. But in the years after the Civil War, the idea was almost absurd.
New York and Brooklyn were separate cities. Brooklyn was growing fast, Manhattan was growing faster. Every day, people, goods, animals, carts, money, food, building materials, and labor moved between them. The East River was not a scenic strip of water. It was a working channel crowded with ferries, sailing vessels, steam traffic, barges, tugboats, and commercial movement. For many people, the ferry was not a pleasant ride. It was a dependency. If the river was rough, the city slowed. If ice moved through the channel, the city struggled. If ferries collided, the danger was immediate. If weather turned bad, crossing could become miserable, delayed, or deadly. The river was narrow enough to tempt engineers and busy enough to terrify them. A bridge could transform both cities. It could let workers cross without waiting on boats. It could let goods move on a schedule not dictated by ice and tide. It could turn Brooklyn from a city across the water into a connected part of a larger urban machine. But the bridge had to obey the river. It could not sit low and block ships. It could not fill the main channel with piers. It could not be a drawbridge that constantly interrupted traffic above and below. The span had to be high. It had to be long. It had to leave the river open. That meant suspension. It meant enormous stone towers, and those towers created the first brutal question. What do you put them on? A suspension bridge is famous for what hangs in the air. The cables, the roadway, the towers rising like stone gates. But none of that matters if the foundations move. The riverbed under the East River was not a clean stone floor waiting politely for engineers. It was mud, sand, gravel, boulders, currents, water, and uncertainty. The towers had to stand firm enough to carry stone, steel cables, roadway, wind, traffic, vibration, and time. Today, an underwater foundation job can call on geotechnical drilling, modern pumps, diving systems, hydraulic equipment, computer modeling, cranes, steel sheet piles, tunnel boring machines, remote sensors, and detailed decompression protocols.
In the 1870s, the solution was more direct. Build a wooden box, float into place, sink it open side down, pump air into it until the water stays out. Send men inside. Let them dig away the riverbed by hand. As the men remove mud and rock, the box sinks lower. As it sinks, build the tower on top of it, adding stone course by stone course, making the whole structure heavier until it presses itself into the bottom. When it reaches the right depth, fill the caisson with concrete and masonry. Then leave it there forever. That was the old method. Simple enough to explain. Terrible enough to live inside. The Brooklyn Bridge used two pneumatic caissons, one for the Brooklyn Tower and one for the New York Tower. Each caisson was enormous, about 102 feet wide, about 172 feet long. An open-bottom timber chamber, iron-bound, built to become both a workplace and a foundation. Think about that size. Not a barrel, not a small diving bell. A wooden room larger than many buildings, sunk beneath one of America's busiest waterways. The caisson had a roof strong enough to carry masonry above it. It had compartments, shafts, airlocks, pipes, and working space below. The New York caisson contained roughly 110,000 cubic feet of timber and more than 200 tons of iron. That was not just a box. It was a buried wooden factory. It had to be strong enough to survive the pressure of the river, the weight of the tower, the movement of workers, the shocks of excavation, and the unexpected violence of a construction site where water, mud, stone, fire, air, and human judgment were all working against each other. The caisson had no room for romance. Every part of it had a job. The roof carried the masonry. The cutting-edge bit into the riverbed. The air pressure kept the working chamber dry. The shafts let workers, spoil, materials, and air move between worlds. The locks controlled the change in pressure. It was a machine made of timber, iron, air, and discipline. And like many old machines, it became dangerous the moment one part of the system misbehaved. At one point during the caisson work, a sudden loss of pressure sent water, mud, and stone upward with enormous force. The accident showed how violent the hidden river could become when the air barrier failed. The caisson survived, but the lesson was clear. The East River was not defeated. It was only being held back. Every shift depended on that invisible balance. Too little air and water could force its way in. Too much time under pressure, and the men themselves paid the price when they came out. That was the cruelty of the method. The same pressure that made the workplace possible made the workers vulnerable. Men entered through air locks that controlled the transition between ordinary pressure and compressed air. Once inside, they were beneath the river, but not underwater in the way a diver is underwater. The river was above and around them. Air pressure was the wall. If the pressure failed, the river could come in. If the pressure held, the men could breathe and dig. But the pressure that saved them from drowning also made the job medically dangerous. The Brooklyn side caisson went down about 44.5 feet. The New York side caisson went much deeper, about 78.5 feet. Every foot mattered. The deeper the caisson sank, the higher the pressure had to be. The higher the pressure, the stranger the human body became. This was the bottleneck at the bottom of the bridge. The engineers knew how to design a span. They knew how to build towers. They knew how to calculate cable loads. They could order stone, timber, iron, and wire. But they were still learning what compressed air did to men. Inside the caisson, the work was physical and repetitive. Workers dug material from the riverbed. They loaded it into containers. They broke up stubborn material. They cleared space so the caisson could settle lower. Sometimes they worked with shovels and picks. Sometimes they used dynamite. The space could be hot, wet, smoky, noisy and confusing. Voices carried strangely. Gas lights burned in air that already felt unnatural. The ceiling overhead was not just a ceiling. It was the underside of the tower. As masons built above, the pressure on the caisson increased. The men below were not digging beside the bridge. They were digging under it while it grew heavier over their heads. That is the physical truth hidden beneath the Brooklyn Bridge. The bridge rose because the foundation sank. And the foundation sank because men dug the riverbed out from underneath it. John A. Roebling had imagined the bridge before any of this work began. He was a German-born engineer, already famous for suspension bridges and wire rope. His idea for the East River Bridge was bold, even by the standards of a century that admired bold engineering. But Roebling did not live to see the project become the structure he designed. In 1869, while working around the ferry slip, his foot was crushed in an accident. Tetanus followed. He died before the great work had really begun. The bridge lost its designer at the start. His son, Washington Roebling, only 32 years old, became chief engineer. That alone would have been a difficult inheritance. Washington was not just taking over a bridge. He was taking over a promise. The cities expected a marvel. The investors expected a result. The public expected a crossing. The newspapers expected drama. The river expected nothing. It simply kept moving. Washington Roebling knew pneumatic caissons mattered. He had studied the method in Europe. He understood that the bridge could not be built unless the towers could stand on firm foundations. But understanding the method did not make it safe. The Brooklyn caisson began the work. It was hard, but it reached rock at about 44.5 feet. Then came the New York caisson. The Manhattan side required a deeper descent. The pressure increased. The danger increased. The workers began to suffer in ways no ordinary construction crew expected. A man could come out after a shift and feel pain so sharp it bent him over. Another could lose the use of his limbs. Another might recover enough to return to work because the job was still there and wages mattered. This is one of the cruel facts of old infrastructure. The body often became the warning system. Before modern gauges, procedures, decompression tables, medical understanding, and worker protections, the evidence appeared in injured men. Dr. Andrew H. Smith, the bridge physician, treated many of the workers and helped study what came to be called caisson disease. Roughly 110 workers developed decompression sickness during the caisson work. That number is important because it tells you this was not one unlucky accident. It was a working condition. It was built into the method. The deeper they went, the more the method hurt them. And in the spring of 1872, the danger became fatal. On April 22nd, German laborer John Myers died after working in the Manhattan caisson. 8 days later, Irish laborer Patrick Mackay died after resurfacing. Within a month, another Irish laborer, Daniel Reardon, also died. Those names matter. Most of the men who worked under the East River did not become part of the legend. Their names did not become tourist signs. Their faces did not become symbols. The bridge became famous. The towers became famous. The Roeblings became famous. But the men who went down into the air locks often disappeared into the machinery of the story. Myers, Mackay, Reardon, 3 names from a much larger workforce. 3 reminders that the foundation was not just timber, stone, and concrete. It was risk. After those deaths, Washington Roebling made one of the most consequential decisions in the project. The New York caisson had not reached the originally desired bedrock depth. Continuing downward would require still greater pressure. Greater pressure meant more sickness. More sickness could mean many more deaths. So Roebling stopped the descent. The Manhattan Tower would not be founded the same way the original plan had imagined. That was not weakness. That was judgment. Engineering is often described as certainty, but real engineering is full of decisions made under incomplete conditions. The plans meet the river. The calculations meet the soil. The ambition meets the body. Roebling had to decide whether the foundation at the reached depth was sufficient. He had to weigh risk against necessity. He had to accept that the river would not give him everything he wanted at a human cost he could justify. And then he had to live with that decision under one of the most visible structures in America. Washington Roebling himself did not escape the caisson. He spent long hours in and around the compressed air work. He became severely ill with caisson disease. His health broke so badly that he could no longer supervise the bridge in the ordinary way. For years, he directed construction from his home in Brooklyn Heights. He watched the site through a telescope. He sent instructions. He depended on his wife, Emily Warren Roebling, to carry information between the sick room and the bridge. Emily learned the engineering language of the project. She became the link between Washington and the men carrying out the work. At the bridge opening, public praise recognized her role because without her, the chain of command might have failed. That part of the story is extraordinary, but should not turn the bridge into a tale of one family alone. The Roeblings mattered. So did the workers. So did the mechanics. So did the masons. So did the cable spinners. So did the men who hauled stone, handled derricks, drilled, shoveled, riveted, measured, and climbed. A bridge of that scale is never built by a single genius. It is built by a system of people, and the dangerous work is usually done by the ones history names least. Once the caisson work ended, the foundations vanished from public view. That is the strange fate of foundations. If they succeed, no one thinks about them. If they fail, everyone notices. The Brooklyn Bridge's most important early work became invisible by design. The caissons were filled. The towers rose above them. Stone arches climbed higher than almost everything around them. The story moved upward, but the buried work remained. The workers had created ground where the river had been. They had given the towers something to stand on. Only then could the bridge become the bridge people recognize today. The towers eventually reached about 276 feet above the water. At the time, they dominated the skyline. These were not decorative piles of stone. They were compression machines. They received the weight and force of the cables. They transferred low down into the foundations. They stood as the visible proof that the invisible work below had held. Then came the cables. The Brooklyn Bridge used 4 main cables, each made of thousands of steel wires. Cable spinning was its own dangerous world. Men worked on narrow catwalks high above the river. Wire traveled back and forth across the span. Strand by strand, the bridge's muscles formed in the air. The suspension system was modern for its time. The use of steel wire helped make the bridge possible at a scale that earlier bridge builders could barely imagine. But again, the glamorous work above depended on the buried work below. A cable can only perform if the towers hold. The towers can only hold if the foundations stay. The foundations only stayed because men went into the caissons. That is why the Brooklyn Bridge is not only a story of steel. It is a story of air pressure, wood, mud, stone, human lungs, human joints, human fear, and a method that made underwater construction possible before modern machines took over. The caisson itself was one of those strange old machines that does not look like a machine at first. It had no wheels. It did not roll down track. It did not swing a boom like a crane. It did not dig with a bucket, but it changed the rules of the river. It turned a wet place into a dry workplace. It used air as a tool. It made pressure into a temporary wall. That is the genius and the danger of it. A normal wall is stone, brick, timber, iron. This wall was invisible. It existed only as long as compressors kept air moving and the system held. The men inside trusted a force they could feel but could not see. They felt it in their ears. They felt it in their breathing. They felt it when they left the caisson too quickly and their bodies rebelled. That made the caisson both breakthrough and trap. Without it, the bridge foundations could not be built the same way. With it, workers entered a medical frontier they had not chosen. This is where modern viewers have to be careful. It is easy to look backward and say they should have known. They should have had better rules. They should have slowed decompression. They should have protected the men. And in one sense, yes. But in another sense, this was how knowledge was often bought in the 19th century, after the body had already paid. Doctors did not yet have the modern understanding of nitrogen bubbles, decompression tables, and controlled descent that divers and tunnel workers would later rely on. The workers were not careless because they became sick. They were being asked to do a job at the edge of what the industry understood. And the bridge was being built in a country that usually learned safety after disaster, not before. Caisson disease was not the only danger on the bridge. The project took 14 years. During that time, men died from falls, falling materials, machinery, failed supports, and the ordinary violence of heavy construction. Accounts of the total death toll vary. Some put it at 21. Others list 27. Some contemporary estimates went higher. The exact number matters, but the uncertainty tells its own story. The project did not keep the kind of worker injury record we would expect today. One engineer later admitted that if they had known so many men would be hurt, they would have kept a list. Think about that. They did not keep the list because they did not expect the injuries. Then the injuries came. The bridge kept going, and the record remained incomplete. That is why when a name survives, it deserves to be spoken carefully. John Myers, Patrick McKay, Daniel Reardon, John French, Thomas Douglas, Neil Mullen, Peter Cope. Some died in caisson work. Some died from derricks, falling stone, failed temporary supports, hoisting machinery, and height. Their deaths were not separate from bridge. They were part of the cost of making it. Not the full cost, but a cost the public could not see on opening day. On May 24, 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge opened. Schools and businesses closed. Crowds came. Fireworks lit the night. The bridge was called an eighth wonder of the world. It was the longest suspension bridge of its time. It joined New York and Brooklyn in a way ferries never could. People walked across a roadway hung high above the East River, between stone towers that had taken years of danger to raise. To the public, the bridge must have felt like proof that the future had arrived. And in many ways, it had. But the future was standing on buried 19th century labor. That is the part to remember. A person walking the bridge saw cables and towers. They did not see the caissons. They did not see the men under pressure. They did not see the mud forced upward in explosions and accidents. They did not see the workers coming home with pain in their joints, weakness in their legs, or sickness no one fully understood. They did not see Washington Roebling confined to his home, still directing the work through Emily. They did not see the engineering compromise under the Manhattan Tower. They saw the triumph. Triumph is real, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is better, because the real bridge is more impressive than the postcard bridge. The postcard says, beautiful stone towers, elegant cables, New York skyline. The real bridge says, a crowded river demanded a crossing. The foundations had to be sunk underwater. Men entered compressed air before medicine could fully protect them. Some never came back. Some came back changed. The chief engineer himself was crippled by the same hidden danger. His wife carried the project through years of work. The towers rose because the caissons sank. And the caissons sank because workers dug the East River out by hand. That is not less inspiring. It is more inspiring because it gives the bridge back its weight. Not just physical weight, human weight. Built before machines is about that weight. It is about the jobs that sound impossible now because we imagine a machine doing them. We imagine an excavator, a boring machine, a crane, a pump system, a safety cage, a digital monitor, a modern crew with modern protocols. But before those systems existed, the work still had to be done. The rivers still had to be crossed. The stones still had to be cut. The mud still had to be moved. The cables still had to be spun. The tower still had to stand. And the burden fell on workers, tools, animals, steam engines, timber structures, hand signals, judgment, and nerve. The Brooklyn caissons were not primitive in the sense of being stupid. They were ingenious. They were enormous. They were carefully designed. They solved a real engineering problem with the technology available. But they also show the limit of old ingenuity. A tool can be brilliant and brutal at the same time. A method can make progress possible and injure the people who perform it. That is why this story should not be reduced to either celebration or horror. It is both. The bridge is beautiful. The work was dangerous. The engineering was brilliant. The medical ignorance was costly. The result changed New York. The price was paid by bodies the city mostly forgot. Today, the Brooklyn Bridge is still a working piece of infrastructure. Cars cross it. Pedestrians cross it. Cyclists cross it. Tourists stop in the middle to take pictures. Commuters move quickly, thinking about meetings, trains, groceries, rent, children, weather, messages, and the rest of ordinary life. That ordinariness is part of the success. Great infrastructure disappears in a habit. If a bridge works long enough, people stop thinking of it as a miracle. They treat it like a route, like a background, like something that was always supposed to be there. But the Brooklyn Bridge was not always supposed to be there. It had to be argued for, designed, funded, authorized, built, endured. And at the very bottom, before the towers, before the cables, before the promenade, before the opening day celebration, there were men under the river turning the impossible into foundation. The next time you see the Brooklyn Bridge, do not only look up. Look down in your mind, down past the traffic, down past the deck, down past the stone arches, down past the waterline, down into the riverbed, to the wooden boxes buried beneath the towers, to the compressed air that held the river back, to the gaslit chamber where men dug mud by hand under more than double normal atmosphere pressure, to the workers who climbed out and learned that the danger could follow them home. That is where the bridge began, not in the skyline, under the East River, in pressure, in darkness, in labor. The modern city walks above that work every day. Most of it never thinks about the men below. That is why these stories matter, because the algorithm remembers famous landmarks. It remembers skylines. It remembers pretty views. It remembers the easy picture, but it forgets quiet labor. It forgets the man at the jack, the shovel, the drill, the cable, the airlock. It forgets the worker who did not design the bridge, did not own the company, did not cut the ribbon, and did not get his name carved into stone. But without him, the stone would have had nowhere to stand. If this story made you see old infrastructure differently, subscribe to Built Before Machines. This channel exists to remember the workers, tools, strange machines, and dangerous methods that built America before modern construction equipment took over. The Brooklyn Bridge was not just built over a river. It was built under one first. And a part of America still rests on what those men left below.